Blessings, everyone. This is Pastor John from Third Presbyterian Church. We're looking at week 10 of our Bible study of amazing wisdom and amazing women. Today, we're going to look at Miriam. Last week, we looked at Hannah, who led a relatively private life and kept all to herself, and her faith was displayed in the quiet background. Miriam is just the opposite. She and her brothers were star players in the histories of the Jews and their escape to the Promised Land. She was outgoing and vocal, and yet these two women are connected. And so we'll discover through this Bible study just how they're connected. Let's take a look first at Miriam. In Exodus 15:20, Miriam is defined by a prophetess. Now, a prophetess was someone called upon to be the voice of God, which of course in those days was very unusual for a woman. But not only were they called to be the voice, they were called to speak out, and they had to do so in such a manner that everyone would hear their voice and know that they were saying something correct, that they were in fact speaking for the voice of God. Again, that was a bold task for a woman in that day and in that age. Now, a lot of this story surrounding Miriam takes place at the Nile River. And so I've put a little graph, a chart, a map of the Egypt, and especially during the travels into the Promised Land. But the purple arrow points to the Nile River. The Nile River is 4,150 miles long, and at its widest point, it's almost 2 miles wide. It's considered by many to be the longest river in the world. It begins with several tributaries, and you can see those all up there at the very top, from the Mediterranean Sea, and it ends in Lake Victoria in Tanzania. This river plays a pivotal role in the story of Moses and Miriam, and it's also an important river for resources for the Egyptian people and of course for the Hebrew people who were living in slavery with the Egyptians when our story takes place. So if you look at this story in Exodus, first of all, there's a report that the Hebrew slaves are multiplying with a rapidity. And the slave masters are afraid that if this doesn't stop as time goes on, they will be so outnumbered by the Hebrew slaves that they will no longer be able to control them. So they go to Pharaoh and they explain what they consider to be this dilemma and this problem. And so Pharaoh gets a hold of all the midwives. Now, back in those days, because birth was something that took place pretty naturally, there weren't maternity wards or birthing rooms or things like that. There were women who were trained to assist a woman in childbirth, and they were called midwives. So Pharaoh brings all the midwives in and says, hey, when you're assisting a Hebrew woman give birth, and if it's a boy that she gives birth to, then immediately kill that child. Well, they really refused to do that. And when confronted again by Pharaoh, their excuse is that the Hebrew women give birth too quickly, and oftentimes they've already born the son and know that he's alive before the midwife even gets there. Well, Pharaoh finally gets tired of their excuses, and he simply orders all the male babies to be killed. And he wants them to be killed by simply throwing them into the Nile River so that they'll drown. Now, Moses' mother is a woman named Jochebed, and she tries to keep him in hiding for about 3 months, but it gets to a place where she feels like she can no longer keep him safe. So she takes him to the Nile River, and she places him in a floating reed basket. So while all the other males were being tossed into the Nile to drown, Moses is put in this basket, and she sends him off onto the Nile River with the hopes that maybe something positive will happen because she can no longer protect him. Now, her daughter, Miriam, who's Moses' brother Moses' sister, and also the sister of Aaron, is watching all of this. So after Jochebed leaves, Miriam watches her brother float down the Nile a little bit until she sees that Pharaoh's daughter has stopped at a point to bathe. And when she sees that, she gets an idea. And this is where we pick up our reading for today. We're reading from Exodus 2, verses 7 through 10 from the New International Version. Then his sister, of course, Miriam, asked Pharaoh's daughter, she's there bathing and comes across Moses in the basket, "Shall I go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl, that's Miriam, went and got the baby's mother, Jochebed. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." So this is the plan that Miriam comes up with. It does two things. It saves her brother, but it also brings her mother back into the picture to actually raise her brother, because after all, that is her son. Now, at that point, there's a lot of missing years after that in the Exodus narrative. We know a lot about Moses, that he did grow up in the house of Pharaoh, and that God would call upon him to lead the people from the harsh treatment in Egypt to the place God identifies as the Promised Land. Now, along the way, Moses runs into opposition with Pharaoh until there's the showdown of those different plagues. And when Pharaoh finally agrees that the people could leave, he dismisses them. You remember they head to the Red Sea. God miraculously parts the Red Sea. And as they are crossing over, they discover that Pharaoh's army is chasing after them until they meet their debacle in the Red Sea. And it's after that place, that point in the story, that we are reintroduced to Miriam. So let's now read from Exodus 15, 20 through 21, again from the New International Version. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver, he has hurled them into the sea." Well, of course, what she's recounting is that when the Hebrew people had gotten safely to the other side of the Red Sea and the Egyptian army was chasing them, suddenly the sea walls came back together and the Egyptian army, those who were in the sea area, were drowned. And of course, those who were on the other side of the Red Sea realized they could no longer advance, and the Hebrew people had found their way into a new place, which would eventually lead them to what we call the Promised Land. Now, it mentions that Miriam sang and she danced, and she also played a timbrel. Well, there's a picture on this page of something that archaeologists believe might have looked like the timbrel. They were in a bit of a metal age back in those days, and so they would have been able to make something like a tambourine to make various different noises. And so she is singing and dancing and playing this timbrel. Obviously, it's a moment of high excitement. The other thing that's important in this story is that it says the women followed her. So apparently Miriam had that kind of personality that was attractive to a bunch of women. Remember, she's a prophetess, and she's called upon to be the voice of God. So she's very vocal and stands up for who she is. I think that won her the admiration of a lot of the other women. Now, after this story in Exodus 15, 20 through 21, we sort of lose track of Miriam. In the book of Numbers, there are several passages that are speaking about Moses, And there's an indication or an implication that Aaron and his sister Miriam are involved in the leadership of Moses, but it doesn't name them directly. Well, we said when we began this study this week, what then is the relationship between Miriam and Hannah? It appears that they're really two different personalities. Well, let's unpack this a little bit. Both women say a family member they loved was called by God into the utmost service for the people of God. Of course, with Hannah, it was her son, Samuel. With Miriam, it was her brother, Moses. But both women experienced a close family member being called by God into service. Both were assured by God that this was the correct call because both had a close relationship with God. And that's an important part of the story. Both Hannah and Miriam were very close in their relationship to God. And so as a result of that, they were both given front row seats to watch everything that was taking place as the stories unfolded with Samuel and with Moses. And they also saw miracles take place right in front of them. The other thing that they had in common was when they experienced this joy, this expression of great satisfaction from God, they expressed their joy to the Lord in a song. Miriam does a dance and plays the timbrel and sings. Hannah writes a song that is very much mirrored by Mary in Mary's song in the New Testament. And even though both experienced some sadness and frustration in their lives, they were able to always turn to rejoicing and praising God. I suspect that that's the reason why these two women are highlighted in the Old Testament story. They were both women who experienced life's difficulties, and yet they were able to both celebrate what God was doing in their lives. Now, let's compare for a moment what excerpts of what each one had to say. If you remember last week when we looked at Hannah and her prayer, here's what it says: "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord, my horn is lifted high up. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like you, Lord. There is no one beside you. There is no rock like our God." And Miriam's song goes along with her dance as she sings, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." So both are talking about joy. Both are talking about being delivered. Both recognize God as high and exalted. They just do it in different words and in different ways of expressing themselves because they were two different kinds of personalities. And so as we look at this story of Miriam, we get to what we call the wisdom of Miriam. So in the very beginning of her story, she sees her mother trying to protect Moses from death. And then when Miriam, has a chance, she hatches a plan to save both Moses and to allow her mother, his mother, the joy of still raising him. And she gets paid for doing it to boot. Number two, she understands Moses is called to serve the Lord. She recognizes that even though she's a voice of God, her brother has been called to lead the people of God. And she trusts in God, even when life is full of difficult moments. And she has a firsthand look at everything. She sees God's work and she sees God's miracles, and she responds with joy. And her joy is expressed with singing and dancing and playing that musical instrument. And according to what we read about Miriam, she never doubts her faith, and she trusts always that God will provide. So when we think about comparing Hannah and Miriam, some questions that I'd like for you to think about. Hannah is a wife and mother, while Miriam is a sister. Does that make a difference in family bonds? In other words, is there a different bond between a woman and her son, and or a woman and her brother? Do both love their family in the same way, or do they love their family in different ways? Number two, how would the story have changed if either Hannah or Miriam, or I suppose both, had lost their faith and didn't trust God? And then the final question to think about is, Miriam was said to have led women in praising God, while Hannah did her praising of God very privately. Is one way better than the other? Should we always be expressing our worship of God in great praises great praises and giant words and actions, or should we be praising God in some of the quiet moments? And I guess the question is, are you more of a Hannah or a Miriam when it comes to praising God? And does God really need both forms of praise? Well, that concludes our Bible study for this week. Next time, we're going to look at Esther, and we're going to look at Esther and compare her to another female biblical character. Now, I want to mention to you that next week is Thanksgiving week, and because it's a short week and we're trying to crunch all of our office activities and all of our other publications and everything else into a 2-day period, we're going to forgo our Bible study until the week after Thanksgiving, and that's when we'll pick up the study of Esther. Thank you so much for taking just a few moments to be a part of this Bible study and learn a little bit more about these important women of the Bible, and particularly today, the important role of Miriam, and how in many ways she's the same and in many ways she's different from Hannah. Have a great week, a good celebration of Thanksgiving, and God bless.